Ryan had noticed that his neighbor Sandra was digging around in her garden at night sometimes. He was curious as to what she was doing and decided to take a closer look. He was shocked when he realized that she was burying jars filled with money in her garden. Why would she do something like that? He was determined to find out, and soon he would understand that her reason was a lot worse than he could have ever imagined. But before we start our story, smash the like button now. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any new stories. Ryan watched his neighbor from the kitchen as she dug yet another hole in her garden. He had watched her do it several times before, but he still hadn't figured out why she was doing it. He was getting more and more curious and decided to look into it. He had many theories about why she was doing that, but the real reason was something way worse than he could have ever even imagined. He decided to keep an eye on her to figure out what was going on, and when he finally put the pieces of the puzzle together, he was shocked. He could not believe what he had just discovered. Ryan realized that he needed to take action. He could not just sit still while something like this was going on next door. He thought of a plan and knew that eventually he would need to get the police involved as well. What did Ryan find out about his neighbor Sandra? Why was she burying the money? And why did he call the police? As Ryan was about to take out the trash, he suddenly saw something that made him stop in his tracks. This was the umpteenth time already. It was already dark outside, but as he gave his eyes some time to adjust to the darkness, he could see it clearly. It was his neighbor, Sandra, sneaking around in her garden again. Ryan had spotted Sandra in her garden at night several times already, but he had no idea what she was doing. They used to be on good terms, and they often made small talk over the garden fence when the weather was nice, but he barely ever even saw her anymore. At least, he barely saw her during the day. Lately, he only ever saw her sneaking around in her garden when it was dark. At first, he thought nothing of it, but as more time passed and he continued to only see her at night, he started to wonder what was going on with her. He decided that it would be weird to just walk up to her and ask her about it. They hadn't spoken in a long time, and Sandra was obviously doing her best not to be seen, so he assumed that she wanted to keep whatever she was doing a secret. So Ryan decided to take a different, less direct approach. He put the trash bag back on the floor and quickly turned off the lights in the kitchen so Sandra would not spot him. Even though she was too busy with whatever it was she was doing, she looked around every now and then, probably to make sure that nobody was watching her. And Ryan didn't want to risk her seeing him. If she did, she would probably think he was a creep. But he was just curious. And if anyone was being creepy, it was definitely her and not him. What was she doing out there in the dark? She was definitely hiding something. Ryan watched her through the window, but he couldn't see what she was doing exactly. He was not close enough, and it was too dark to make out anything other than a human shape moving around. Suddenly, he remembered that he had a pair of binoculars somewhere. That could maybe help him see it better. He looked around for it, and he couldn't find it at first. Finally, he found the binoculars in a kitchen drawer. He'd been looking for it for a few minutes, and he better hurry now. Sandra would probably be almost finished with whatever she was doing, and she would soon head back inside. Ryan quickly walked over to the window and was relieved when he saw that his neighbor was still out there. He looked through the binoculars and he saw that she sat on her knees, digging in the grass with a small gardening shovel. He thought that was very weird, seeing as it was completely dark out there. She surely wasn't gardening, right? He was even more curious about what Sandra was doing there now. It was the middle of the night, and that woman sat there, in her garden, digging around in the mud. And what made it even weirder was that it wasn't the first time he had seen her doing this. Ryan knew that it wasn't his place, but he couldn't help himself. He desperately wanted to know what she was doing there. So, instead of leaving the woman alone and dropping the binoculars, he grabbed a chair and dragged it to the window to make himself comfortable while he kept an eye on his neighbor. Finally, he noticed that there was a bag on the ground next to her. She opened it up and took something out of it, and when Ryan saw what it was, he gasped. Why did she have that with her? And what was she going to do with it? You see, the thing that Sandra had taken out of the bag was a glass jar, and it was filled with money. Ryan couldn't believe his eyes as he watched her put the jar inside the hole she had just dug, and slowly but surely she filled it back up and closed the hole until it had completely disappeared. He didn't understand. Was his neighbor really burying money in her backyard? And if so, why? He couldn't think of any possible explanation that made any sense. Or perhaps there was no real explanation and the woman was just going crazy. Either way, he was determined to find out more. Of course, Ryan would not just go to her house and straight up ask her what she was doing. Instead, he had another idea. He would just watch her from the kitchen and try to figure out what she was doing, and more importantly, why she was doing it. He hoped that this way he would be able to answer at least some of the questions he had. And so the next day, as soon as it got dark, he sat in front of the window in his kitchen again. Lights out, binoculars in his hand. He was ready. He waited and waited. But at the end of the night, he felt disappointed. Sandra had not shown up at all. The next few nights, the same thing happened. Ryan waited by the window to see whether she would come to the garden, but she didn't. 2 weeks passed, and Sandra had only come out to the garden twice. That's when Ryan realized it. She did not bury the money jars every day, but every week. He wondered what her reason for this was. Was this some weird way of saving money, or was she hiding it from someone? Ryan had no idea, but he had noticed something else about his neighbor Sandra that he thought was a bit odd. He had never paid attention to it before, but now that he had been keeping an eye on her, he couldn't ignore it. Sandra was constantly on the move. She was at home every day, but she left the house at least once an hour, and she never stayed gone for long. Also, she often received mysterious visitors. Cars would stop by her house, and some people that Ryan didn't know were coming and going all the time. After paying attention to those mysterious visitors, a feeling of unease came over Ryan. He started to recognize one of the men who always came over to Sandra's house, and even though Ryan didn't want to judge anyone by their appearance, the man didn't look like a friendly guy. What did he have to do with Sandra? He seemed quite shady, and he didn't look like someone she would be friends with. Ryan felt like something was a bit off here, but he didn't want to get involved, that is, until one night, when he heard something that made him change his mind. It was Thursday again, the day that Sandra always buried her money jars in her garden. Ryan watched her from the kitchen again, binoculars in his hand. It had been a warm day, so he had left the window open, and that's when he heard this strange sound. At first, he thought that a cat was meowing in his garden, or perhaps some bird was making weird noises, but the noise did not stop, and soon, after looking around a bit more, Ryan realized what the sound actually was. It was Sandra, and she was crying. He watched her wipe the tears off her face while she continued digging another hole in the ground. She looked so sad. Suddenly, something just took control over Ryan, and he opened the door, stepped outside, and walked toward the fence separating their gardens. Once he stood there and he realized what he had done, he regretted his decision. She hadn't noticed that he was there yet, so maybe he could just sneak away again without being seen. He had already turned, ready to walk back to his house, when he heard the woman crying softly again. He sighed and turned back around. He couldn't just ignore her like this. Sandra? Are you okay?" he asked her. As soon as she heard him, she quickly hid the money jar. She probably had no idea that he had already seen it, and looked at him angrily. "What are you doing here? Go away," she told him. Ryan had not expected such a reaction, and he was surprised. However, he didn't give up and stayed by the fence until Sandra was ready to talk to him. She told him everything. She had lost her job and somehow wound up under the command of a wanted criminal. She needed to deal with all the dirty jobs as a way of making money, but lately, her new boss had been taking a lot more money from her than they had agreed on. So, she hid the money in her garden, where she knew he wouldn't find it. In the end, Ryan helped Sandra get away from the criminal life, and he helped her find a job that she enjoyed, and that paid well enough for her to lead a comfortable life. Happy end.